Hi, welcome back. As promised, I've done a few videos on Virgil's Aeneid and Homer's Odyssey. I hope you had a great Christmas and New Year, and I'm going to pick up where I left off with those epics. You're going to expect lots more variety in the videos this year. We're going to look at more Greek tragedies, more material culture and more mythology as well. So welcome to new subscribers. I'm Millennial Classicist, Maria Haley, and if you like this channel, please like, share and subscribe to keep it going. Okay, so today we're going to have a look at women in the Odyssey. Last time we had a look at this topic, I'll link the video in the description below. We looked at the women that Odysseus meets on his wanderings and back home in Ithaca a little bit by looking at Penelope, Nausicaa, Calypso and Circe. Today, as promised, we're going to have a little look at the women back in the household, so the kind of slave women, the servant women that contribute to the household in Ithaca. The two main characters we're going to be thinking about today are Eurykleia and Melantho, and they're pretty much the opposite of one another. So Eurykleia is the nurse of Odysseus' household. She is an older woman in the Odyssey. She's not one of the women who is kind of a detaining female because she's not of maritable age. She is a member of Odysseus' household. Eurykleia is really important in the Odyssey because she puts down roots in Ithaca. She's part of what makes the palace in Ithaca an oikos, a household with lots of different family and slaves who participate and engage in the household, like an extended family, okay? Although Eurykleia is a slave, and that is really difficult for us to wrap our heads around, for an audience of Homer, that would be more typical. Slavery was pretty typical in the ancient world and kind of expected in the Homeric world. Another thing to notice is that slaves were treated very differently in different households in these sorts of texts. So, for example, Eurykleia is pretty much like a godmother to the men in that household. She's treated very well, she has a special status and respect in the family, so it's actually sometimes really easy to forget that she is a slave when you're reading the epic. Yurikleia has a history. So she was brought to Odysseus' household by Laertes, Odysseus' father, and she's held up as being really special. Laertes has a special relationship with Yurikleia, almost holding her in the same kind of high esteem that he held his wife. So we find this out right at the very beginning of the epic, in Book 1. When Yurikleia is first introduced to us, she is Yurikleia, the daughter of Ops, son of Pisenor. Her long ago Laertes had bought with his wealth when she was in her first youth and gave for her the price of 20 oxen. Must be a lot, I'm only going to assume. And he honoured her even as he honoured his faithful wife and his halls, but he never lay with her in love, for he avoided the wrath of his wife. Remember, his wife is Anticleia, so there's this really interesting pairing of the name of Odysseus' mother, Anticleia, and Odysseus' kind of almost nurse or stepmother. I mean, she's not technically his stepmother, she is his nurse, but she has this really maternal affection towards Odysseus and Telemachus, and that's something we see developed in Book 1. Notice that Eurykleia also has a famous family, so she's been taken in part of a conquest, but she's respected and esteemed for where she's come from. She's not a common person, and this is almost like a mark on her virtue or on her character, that she's been raised in a certain way and she's going to know how things should go in the palace. If you want a more modern or more relatable parallel, think about Romeo and Juliet and the role that the nurse plays when she's looking after Juliet, and that's kind of a rough parallel. I tend to think of Eurykleia as Mrs. Weasley and Anticleia as Harry Potter's mum. That kind of foster mother relationship that she seems to have really reminds me of Mrs. Weasley, and the kind of idea of an older, more kind of maternal and nurturing woman. That is what we find in Eurykleia. This is built up in Book 1, and we also see this through her affection for Telemachus. So our expectations of Eurykleia are really set up right at the outset of the epic. So Eurykleia it was who bore for Telemachus the blazing torches, for she of all the handmaids loved him most, and had nursed him when he was a child. Here we see Eurykleia is more than just a slave, she's a wet nurse almost for Telemachus. This idea that she had nursed him suggests that she would actually be breastfeeding Telemachus. So she's got a kind of intimacy and that real bond with him. And for that reason we need to start thinking of Eurykleia almost as a family member, even though there are occasions where her status as a slave becomes clear. Yurikleia becomes important again as one of Odysseus's layers of recognition when he returns to Ithaca. So Eurykleia is the person who ultimately recognises Odysseus, even though he's sort of disguised in the palace. And I'll give you a fuller video, which I'll link below, on the layers of Odysseus's return. It is really easy when you read the Odyssey to forget just how much of it takes place in Ithaca. Eurykleia is most famous for recognising Odysseus' scar, and this is because she is tasked with bathing him as part of Xenia. She is the one to wash the beggar's feet, and she sees the scar on Odysseus' leg from a boar hunt when he was young. Again, the recognition is described in a lot of detail. We get the backstory as to how and why Odysseus has got this scar, and of course Eurykleia knows the story. You could think of that recognition of the scar as kind of viewing an old family photograph or something like that. She knows his backstory and who he is and where he has come from, and it speaks to the intimacy between Odysseus and Eurykleia as much as it tells us about Odysseus being recognised. Okay, so it adds a layer of pathos and intrigue to Odysseus' return home. Throughout the revenge against the suitors, Yurikleia is really helpful. She is the one who tries to convince Penelope that Odysseus is back and hatch this plan. She is also the one who is most excited when the suitors are killed. It's actually a little bit jarring when you go and read Eurykleia's response to the death of the suitors. So much so that Odysseus actually tells her to calm down and bite down her kind of sense of vengeance because he's worried that she's going to offend the gods. And she's really the most invested in the vengeance against the suitors. Perhaps because she has a lot of loyalty to the house and a lot of history there. Okay, so it's a really unusual read that might seem out of context for an older character, but again, if you think about the Mrs. Weasley comparison, we've all seen that vengeful side when older women start to defend their families. The antithesis of Eurykleia is Melantho. The death of the maids in the house follows the death of the suitors. Remember, women in the Homeric world would be within women's quarters in the palace. They would be there accompanying Penelope, and they would be weaving and contributing to the household through different tasks. And Melantho is twinned with Melanthius, the goat herd who's really disloyal to Odysseus and really loyal to the suitors. So Melantho and Melanthius both take their stem from Melos, from this kind of idea of black or dark-heartedness, and they both have ill will towards Odysseus. They are both of poor character. But we learn that Melantho is the inverse of Eurykleia. So whereas Eurykleia was brought to Odysseus' house and integrated herself as a family member, and she raised Odysseus and she raised Telemachus, and Laertes was very sympathetic towards her even though he didn't have sex with her, Melantho is the opposite. Melantho has been raised in Odysseus' household, but we learn in book 18 that Melantho, whom Dolius begot, but whom Penelope had reared and cherished as her own child, and gave her playthings to her heart's desire. Yet even so, she had at heart no sorrow for Penelope, but on the contrary loved Eurymachus and slept with him. She then scolded Odysseus with words of blame. Now at this point, Melantho doesn't realise that Odysseus is in disguise, but notice how Homer's really careful not to mention the name of Melantho's mother. So, in the way that Homer allows this description to run, and this is true in the translation from the Greek, her mother's never named. So Penelope is really positioned as the maternal figure in Melantho's life, and yet, rather than sympathising for Penelope while Penelope is being pursued by suitors, Melantho actually sleeps with one of the suitors for herself, which ... would presumably carry on if that suitor married Penelope. So she doesn't have loyalty to the household. She's not grateful for the upbringing that she's received. She's taken a lot, whereas Eurykleia has given a lot. And whereas Eurykleia recognises Odysseus, Melantho does not, and she treats him really harshly, a little bit like the a little bit like the goat herd that we see in part of the recognition video, which I'll link below. She's not accommodating Odysseus, but she's also not showing good Xenia. And remember, that sense of hospitality, that sense of treating strangers well, is a good base mark for the morality of a character. If they're not good at hospitality, if they can't be good towards a stranger, that suggests that they're not a very genuine person, that they're not a very sincere character, because if they can't be nice to a stranger, we might assume that they're only really nice to people when they think they're going to get something positive from it and when they think it's going to be an advantage to them. So this really culminates in the death of the maids at the end of the Odyssey. This is a really controversial section of the Odyssey that a lot of modern scholars find quite tricky, because it shows Odysseus' vengeance to go beyond the suitors into the women of his own household, and he has a real mistrust for the women. Notice that not just Melantho, but other women within the household are killed at this point, and I think it's Yurikleia who says that the women have generally been unfaithful. Now, think about ancient and modern audiences. For an ancient audience, that might be a really unheard of or really awful thing, or a really deep betrayal. For a modern audience, we might understand and be more sympathetic to the idea that these women are slaves. So they're going to live in the way that suits them. They're going to take whatever comfort they can when they can. And if Odysseus, their owner, has disappeared for 10 years and there are some new owners in town, why should they be loyal? They are slaves. Okay, so it really depends on ancient and modern readings of the text. The way that the maids die is particularly gruesome. So what Odysseus does is he has them come in and clean up the bodies of the suitors. Now this is upsetting for them, but particularly so because a lot of them have had relationships with these men. And if you look really closely at this scene, you'll notice that the maids are crying because they're really tidying up the bodies of their lovers. So on the one hand, it's very, very cruel. On the other hand, it's a good test to see if these women have actually been unfaithful to Odysseus, because as we heard when we thought about Eurykleia, surely if you were loyal to Odysseus, the death of these men wouldn't really bother you that much. You would actually be quite pleased. So maybe cleaning up the men could be read as a test. The maids are then, having cleaned up the suitors' bodies, hanged. And the text presents a real problem here. It becomes quite tricky for people to read and understand how they were hanged simultaneously, because it's not clear if separate nooses were drawn up for each of the maids, or if they were all kind of hanged in one swift motion, which is what the text suggests. But as scholars have pointed out, really we're getting more bogged down in the intricacies and the logistics of how the maids were hanged, which, given that it's a really old text, it's from sort of 8th century BC, there's probably a textual corruption in there. We've probably got a few lines missing, that we're actually forgetting about why they were hanged and whether they should have been hanged in the first place. This is the note that the Odyssey ends on before we go and look at the suitors in the underworld. A really strange book in book 24 that draws together key themes throughout the epic. So it's up to you when you're reading to decide if Odysseus' actions are unjust, and think about it sensitively from a modern audience's point of view versus an ancient audience's point of view. If you're interested in these videos and you'd like to learn more about the Odyssey, have a look at the artwork I've made on Redbubble based around the text. I've included maps, character images and infographics, all to help your understanding of the text, and also just decorate your homes as well. Absolutely beautiful. Okay, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to keep the channel going. Thanks.